You ready to film another exciting episode of Real Good at Doing Stuff?
I can't wait.
Gotta be more exciting for TV.
I can't wait.
Okay, good. There we go. Real good stuff doers of real good stuff, prepare yourself for another inconceivably exciting episode of Real Good at Doing Stuff. Today we're going to tear down a motor of Mike Finnegan's. You can tell by the yellow valve covers that this is out of, I think, what they call rubber ducky, which I don't know anything about, but you guys probably do because you watch automotive YouTube, and that's what that's on. So this is a big block Chevrolet, and all I know is I've been told it has valvetrain issues, and we're going to find out what's up with that. Mike doesn't like valvetrains, apparently. He's pretty intent on destroying them. So we have to combat Mike's attempts to destroy his valvetrain and make it indestructible. So that's the plan here. I don't even know exactly what this thing's what the purpose of it is, but we'll figure that out through the process. But today we're going to just tear things down and kind of look at it and see what's going on. I know when they pulled the valve covers off, this guy here was off of the push rod. So that's a thing. I don't know what that means, but maybe we'll get to the bottom of it. Anyhow, let's get started ripping this thing apart and see what we find. we've got rubber ducky apart. Now the reason it's here is to resolve valvetrain issues. There was nothing terribly torn up in there or anything, but there was a rocker arm jumped off, push rod kind of doing nothing. So it's here for valvetrain issues. We're going to try to straighten that out. From what I understand, it's not going back in the yellow Camaro, it's going in a wheel standing truck of some sort. So I don't know what that means yet. I'll find out. Anyhow, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the forces involved in valvetrain issues that engine builders deal with. I tried to explain them a little bit for some of you guys that may be a little newer to this. This is an intake valve. I think it actually may be the ones out of this motor. The cam that's in it is about 680 lift, which means that every time that valve opens, it opens 680 thousandths, and then it has to close 680 thousandths. It's a solid roller camshaft. It's a Howard's cam. I don't think it's anything exotic or weird. It's kind of a standard type solid roller deal. I haven't rolled the cam to find out anything about it specifically yet, but I do know those factors. And the issue that I'm seeing here that's jumping out at me is spring pressure. These springs look kind of run-of-the-mill, what would come on an over-the-counter big block Chevrolet head that's sold as maybe solid roller. They kind of use the cheapest stuff available sometimes, but that's what these look like to me. Anyhow, one of the things we do is we measure the installed height that the springs are set at, right? And that's basically when they're installed on the head, the distance from under the retainer to the seat, to the spring seat, right? That's basically how much this is compressed at a starting point. When the valve is on the seat, how much this is compressed, and we measure how much spring pressure we have there. In this case, that's 1.950 inches, right? We use a device called a height mic to figure that out. All right, at 1.950 inches, this thing has right at 200 pounds, right? And I checked all of them, and they range anywhere from 195 to 205, right? For an application like that, that's probably on the low side, and that may be the entire root of the issue here. That's probably the first thing we're going to do is get a little better spring on here and pump things up. There are other issues that come into play here. The mass of the valve train is super critical in this department. In this case, we already have a titanium retainer on here, and a lightweight retainer is kind of, in my opinion, mandatory on something like this, because your retainer is just a necessary evil. It's just dumb weight out here on the valve that has to stride that whole way 680 thousandths every time. You have to have it hold the spring on here, but other than that, it's not doing you any good, right? So the lighter it is, the better off you are, for obvious reasons. When you open the valve, let's say this thing is going to go to 525 or so over the nose. That's the pressure when the valve is open. That's kind of how much energy we have stored to close that valve in an acceptable amount of time, right? Another factor here is RPM, right? When I say acceptable amount of time, as RPM increases, that time decreases, right? You have less time to close the valve. Therefore, this becomes more and more important, right? In this case, we've already got a tie retainer, so that's pretty good. We can't really improve that. Fun little fact here, the tie retainers are not your only option. Matter of fact, in a lot of your high-end endurance racing, very expensive engines, they've gone back to steel years ago, and they use exotic steels that are DLC coated and whatnot. And the problem with tie is over time it will wear, right? And that spring will cut right through that guy. That's just fact. So if you're thinking ties, the be all and end all, and retainers, not so fast. Okay, another big, huge factor here, probably the biggest factor, is the valve itself, the weight of the valve. And this is where there's no cut and dry, well, you need X amount of seat pressure to make this work. Well, you can solve the problem by lightening up the valve, right? If this thing is done at, say, 6,000 in a big block with this type of setup, in a small block, it might go to 7, just because the small block valve is lighter, period. That means it has less work to do to close that, for the spring to do, closing that valve. So lightening the thing up is crucial. This is one of the reasons that a modern engine like the LS is so successful. Here's a factory LS valve. It's 8 millimeter. The heads are very thin but strong somehow. Whatever they make these things out of is pretty damn tough. But they are an excellent, or that's one of the reasons they work so well. This is just inherently light from the start. Let's weigh this. I'm just curious what the differences are here. This steel big block valve, 146 grams or so. Small block steel valve, 102. So massive difference. Now, the other thing that you can do in a lot of applications, racing applications, is go to a titanium valve, right? This is a titanium valve. Now, it's not a good comparison because this valve is significantly bigger. It's a much bigger head and a much longer stem. This is probably out of a Big Duke type or Big Chief type engine that requires a much more massive valve. Not to mention the cross section in the head is much thicker because it's for big boost type deal, right? But even so, this weighs 6 to 8 grams lighter, even though it's a significantly larger valve in every dimension. It's lighter, right? So what I'm getting at is you could solve the problem just by lightening that up. Now in this case, that's probably not the direction we're going to go, because this is expensive. Sometimes it requires special seats in the head. It's a lot of expense and work involved, and for an engine like this we don't necessarily need it, right? So we can probably solve our problems by beefing up the spring and addressing things on that side of the equation. Much cheaper. All right, now we're going to go and look at another area of this that's often overlooked, but engine builders have to deal with this all the time. Another often overlooked side of this, but one that's very important. Let's go over that. All right, so here we got a camshaft, lobes. As this turns in the engine, this is where we're going to get our lift from, right? The lifter is in the block and it's riding on this lobe. As it turns, it goes up and then down. It follows the lobe, ideally, right? The push rod sits in the lifter, and its job is to transfer this travel into the rocker arm, which is sitting up here on the cylinder head somewhere. And it's going to in turn pivot and open the valve, right? Now, the rocker arm ratio is how we determine, or is another factor in how we determine how much lift we're going to have at the valve, right? So an engine like this, let's say it has, this is a 1:7 ratio rocker, probably, yes, 1:7. So that means that this lift here, let's say it's close to 400 thousandths lift at the lobe, right? We'll get multiplied times 1.7 and we're going to end up with 680 lift, right? In theory. Plus or minus our lash, depending on whether we're talking about net lift or gross lift. Anyhow, as we're opening the valve, we're working against the spring pressure, right? That's a resistance that we're dealing with. And as we get towards maximum lift, we have our over the nose spring pressure, in this case probably over 500 pounds of spring pressure over the nose. And then as we close, our spring pressure is decreasing until we get back to our seat pressure, right? Another factor here that's often overlooked is the push rod itself, and in general valve train rigidity, right? And where this matters is, if this push rod is not up to snuff, if it's, in this case, this is a kind of a run-of-the-mill comp cams Magnum push rod, 3/8 80 thousandths wall. Not completely terrible for this application, but probably could be improved on, right? But let's imagine this as a 5/16 push rod to amplify our problem in our head here, right? The faster we turn this thing, the more work this push rod kind of has to do, right? It's working against a lot of resistance. And what happens is the push rod will naturally flex, right? It tries to distort and squirm instead of opening the valve, right? Now, the problem with that is when that happens, not only are you potentially not opening the valve like you intend to and distorting the lobe design, right? But you're also, as this push rod distorts, you're turning it into essentially a straight spring, right? It's being kind of turned into a spring, and at some point, and it's a spring on the wrong side of this pivot, right? So now you have a spring trying to keep the valve open, the same time you have one trying to close it, if that makes sense, right? And at some point, this energy that's used in distorting this push rod is going to be returned, right? And a lot of times I think that actually happens right as the valve changes direction, you start to close the valve, right? So all that's no good. You don't want that happening, because any energy you store in the push rod over here is subtracted from the spring that's trying to return the valve to its seat, right? So that's not good. You want to try to avoid that. And one of the ways you can fix that is by going to a heavier, beefier, stiffer push rod, right? Or valve train in general. Now, I know I just told you that it's super important that your valve train is really light to make all this work better. But on this side of the rocker arm, it's much less critical. Matter of fact, you can a lot of times get away with murder over here, right? You wouldn't believe the weight of some of the push rods we have in these big turbo deals, right? They're nuts, right? And it doesn't really matter. They work great. The reason being is you have all this mechanical advantage working in your favor in that department, right? This way you have mechanical advantage working against you, but closing it, the rocker is helping you with weight on this side of the rocker arm. So that all kinds of works out in your favor, and you can get away with, and it's often very advantageous to have a beefy, stout push rod, right? Now, I'm speaking in terms of your average drag engine or whatever that's not super scienced out. I'm not talking about cup motors that have valve springs like click pins, you know. Now, the same principles apply, but they lighten everything to extreme so that they can do what they need to do. I'm talking about your average stuff that you're going to see at the drag strip. This is kind of how this works, right? So there's multiple facets of your valve train that you need to be aware of, and there's other ones too. These are just a few that I'm talking about. But anyhow, in the case of this engine, probably the biggest thing we're going to do is just put a better spring on there, get in a better situation. I probably will roll the cam, just make sure there's nothing weird going on there, and valve job, fix everything up, make sure it's all good, and go back together. And I'll try to bring you guys along through that process. But anyhow, that's enough for today. Like, share, subscribe, unsubscribe, whatever you want to do. Merch is at HarrellEngine.com. You can buy snazzy shirts like this. Golly, look at this. Anyhow, that's enough for today. Whatever, who cares?